Wonderful. I think we're live, Amy. Okay, welcome everyone to the final talk of the festival. How exciting. I just want to take a moment to wish Ingrid Kopp, the co-director of Electric South, the coolest person I know. And the reason we are even here today, a very, very happy birthday. I'm also extremely excited. Woo! I'm also extremely excited that we have made it to the final talk. This festival is just such a crazy blessing, stemming from the need to pivot with the times and adjust our offering for the pandemic. And I'm so incredibly proud of the team of kick-ass females running the show behind the scenes, and I'd like to take the opportunity once again to also thank our sponsors. So today's discussion is going to be quite a treat. I have Amy Louise Wilson joining me, and we'll be diving deeper into a film, Another Kind of Dying, which is part of the films that are shown this year. So if you haven't seen the films, please go and check it out. It's absolutely free. You do not need a headset. And we'll also be touching on immersive theatre and the future of immersive theatre in Africa. So Amy, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction on who you are. Amy is a performer, a writer, a creative producer. Together with artist Francois Knutzer, she co-founded the Low Day Film Factory, an experimental community cinema collective. Since graduating from Rhodes University and the University of Cape Town with an honours degree in drama, she's appeared in numerous local and international film and television theatre productions. Notable credits include Fox's The Book of Negroes and Netflix's series Troy, The Fall of the City. She has been experimenting with creating live solo performance, beginning with her living room lecture performance, Other People's Homes, at Mason Sacree, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in New York. She is the recipient of the 2019 De Stael National Playwright Award for her play Another Kind of Dying, which she has subsequently adapted to create her first 360 video. I just have to make a disclaimer that I am probably the most biased person to conduct this talk because I absolutely love Amy and her partner Francois so much. They could both put brown bags over their heads and walk around calling it art, and I would probably think it was the best thing ever.
Don't give us any ideas.
Sure. However, I'm sure that Amy and I can shed some light on this particular film and also its themes. And also share the excitement that we feel about how Africa is positioned to take on the mantle of immersive theatre. So just for context, we'll play the trailer, just for those of you who are joining us, just so you can get a little bit of a context if you haven't seen the film already.
Ubukrelekrele obungaka buthatha yintoni le ilapha kuwe ngaphakathi ikwenze ucinge ukuba ubomi bakho bungatshintsha?
Okay. So Amy, the opening lines of the film for me are so powerful. How did you get brave? How did you get that thing inside you that makes you know your life can be different? Ironically, those are the words that we are probably all living by during this year of our pandemic, 2020. Bravery's become an everyday necessity. So before we discuss the finer details of this film, tell us what Another Kind of Dying is in your own words.
So Another Kind of Dying is a 360 video experience. It's based on the play that I wrote by the same name, which won the Distel National Playwriting Competition. So I originally wrote it as a full-length play for a cast of, was going to be, Apiwe was going to play the central character Silumko, and then there was going to be a cast of, I think it was like 5 in total, because there was going to be kind of a chorus, almost like a Greek chorus, that was sort of commenting on the action and on the stage with him at all times and playing a whole lot of different characters that come in and out of his life. So that was how it was originally conceived. And as part of Distel, that competition, you get a mentor. So I was mentored by quite a well-known South African playwright, Mike van Graan, to write the play. And when your play wins the Distel competition, Distel, in collaboration with the National Arts Festival, they produce the play, or they should produce the play, and it should premiere at the National Arts Festival. But obviously the pandemic happened and that was thwarted. So it was this great disappointment because we were like gearing up to, put the play on. We had started casting already. Joanna Evans, who is a really incredible director, she's based in New York. She was going to come, she was like on the way to booking her flights to come to Cape Town and direct it. We were about to start rehearsals at the Fugard Theatre, and the play was booking all of these other venues after the National Arts Festival to go and tour like venues around South Africa. But of course that couldn't happen. And so we just had this period of being like, what is going to happen with this thing and what is going to happen with this story? And I was so devastated at the idea of not being able to put this story on as a play, that I was just kind of sitting in this like terrible feeling about this not being able to happen as I had written it and as I had imagined it. And then National Arts Festival said, okay, we are doing a virtual festival this year. And do you think that you could try to reimagine this work in some way, or some aspect of the work at least? And at first my thinking was no, and I actually said no. I was like, no, I wrote this as a play, it needs to be theatre, this is what it is, this is how I imagined it. And Rusira Sital, who's the director of the artistic director of the National Arts Festival, she kind of prompted me to think a little bit further. And I started thinking about 360 video as kind of the closest thing that I could think of to recreate that experience of being in the theatre with this actor. That was sort of the, like when you talk about being brave, it was like my first time working in 360, but I think out of restriction and necessity, often quite interesting things are born, in terms of like artistic experimentation and expression that probably would never have happened otherwise. And once I started going into this world of working with the story in 360, I was realizing like there are so many things that I can do with the story that I wouldn't have been able to do in the theatre. So just to speak a little bit about the play is about a young man called Silumko who lives in rural Eastern Cape, just outside of Alice. And he, after the death of his father, who works on a building on a construction site in Joburg, he makes this kind of odyssey to move to Joburg and to find out more about his father's death, but it also kind of is this inward and this spiritual journey at the same time as this geographical journey is happening. And so you're flipping between these two spaces of being in the inner city in Joburg and being in the rural Eastern Cape. And we had been thinking with a theatre piece, like, how are we going to do this? You know, because it flips through these different time zones and it flips through these different landscapes, and we want the audience to be able to follow us on this kind of dreamlike journey. It's not chronological, it's happening in all these different spaces. And we had a few ideas of how we were going to stage it, but it was going to be really, really, really challenging. And then with 360, I was suddenly like, oh my goodness, I have so much more freedom in this way. I can literally build anything, I can do anything I want, and I can take the audience on this journey through these different spaces and through time. And so I realized that there was no way that I wanted to try and condense, you know, a full-length play into a 15-minute or however long it is 360 video. But instead of trying to kind of tell this whole story, I sort of tried to craft the world more and to give viewers just an experience more in a more of a like contemplative, meditative way, where they could kind of meet this character and sit with him and sort of get in and out of the like psychological contours and sort of experience his almost like dreamlike imaginings of home and of his new home in the city. So I guess that's sort of a brief like background to what this experience is.
I think that this story, or even the theatre piece and now the 360 video, is a typical example of when life gives you lemons. And I think that there's so much to unpack. But I want to start with some of the themes within the film. There were a few moments that really stood out to me. The first being when Silumko is stating that he'd rather not go to school than be late. That was such a very real moment. He's obviously a young man with hopes and dreams, and his circumstances are really what's holding him back. And it's such a real thing for a lot of people in our country and on this continent. And I'd just like to know, obviously your lived experience without a doubt differs to Silumko's. So what was the writing process for you? Was it a collaborative effort between yourself and Apiwe? And were there parallels that you could draw upon from your own life?
Yeah, so Apiwe Levy is a really incredible actor from the Eastern Cape who now lives here in Cape Town. And we've been working together for many years. We toured a production together all over the country and internationally for a year, and we got to know each other really well in that time. And slowly, he's quite a private person, but slowly he started to tell me the story of his life and some of the things that he's been through. And I started saying to him, like, I want to write a piece for you to perform. And he gave me permission to do that. But as the story developed, I started to realize that it was too limited to try to keep it true to life. And so it kind of took off, like it had its departure in that place, but it took its own journey, which moved very, very far away from Apiwe's own life experience. So it's not at all a true story, but it's really based on a lot of conversations that we've had over the years. And it was always written for him. It was always written with him in mind.
Okay.
And then when it came to writing the script, Apiwe would consult with me. So I would go, it was quite an isolated way that I wrote the script. I wouldn't say it was like a collaborative script writing process, but I would go away and I would write and I would write and I would write and I would write. And then I would come back to him with 10 more pages. And then he would give me notes. He would be like, no, that doesn't make sense. Or why didn't you make the auntie like this or whatever? And so that's kind of how it grew. But what was really funny was every time I would give the script to him, he would say, yes, great, I love it, but I still think it should be a one-person play. Like, he didn't want there to be other actors on the stage. And now it's funny, in the film, you know, it is a one-person experience. But just to go back to your question about it being, you know, really different from my own experience and my own life. I think, you know, as an actor, that's my background. And I've always been a reader as well. And I've always, since I've been little, I've always just wanted to like be everyone else. And I've always wanted to know what it's like to be everyone else. And I've always had this thing in my mind. This is something that they teach you early on in writing, is like, write what you know. You know, you've heard that expression before, write what you know, which is kind of like, it's never been that helpful to me. It's always sounded almost like a threat, you know, like, stay in your lane. And for me, like, with a lot of really great literature and a lot of great films, you know, if writers only wrote what is completely autobiographical to them, a lot of this amazing work would never exist. So I kind of disagree with the idea that you should just make work, you know, about people that are fundamentally exactly like you, whether it be like racially or sexually or genetically or politically or whatever. But you do have a responsibility to treat a story always with sensitivity and with great care and respect, and with specificity. That is something that is like crucial, and that comes from research. That comes from a great deal of research. So I kind of feel like you know, whenever you write a story, you take an imaginative leap and you say, okay, I am supposing that my own experience of grief or of loss or of, you know, joy or of discovering myself could be somewhat like what someone else has experienced. I don't know, I guess it's up to like viewers or readers to say if the imagining has been authentic enough. But as an artist, I feel like you have to try.
Yes, and I think I'm glad that you mentioned how intricately involved Apiwe was in this process. I think that there was a very definite sense of the story was handled with care. So I'm glad that you know, it was something that, to me, what felt like a real, true sort of collaboration between the two of you.
Yeah.
And another thing that I sort of wanted to discuss was Silumku appears to have a real distaste for his father's complacency in the city, or at least what appeared to me as his father's complacency in the city and in general. And as a person of color, there have been moments in life where the older generations who are at ease with sort of accepting the status quo really sort of like rocks my core. And I'm sure you have your own frustrations as well. But how do you think that, or rather tell me how you sort of were able to put yourself in his shoes?
Yeah. So what the part that you're talking about in the film, really in terms of the story, at this point, Silonko is trying to reckon with the decisions that his father has made and how they impact his life. And he is in this new city and he is trying to make decisions about himself and his sexuality and what his future should be. And all of these questions are coming out about how much agency he really has, or whether these decisions and this path has already been decided for him. And so he goes back to this moment when he says, you know, in the film, when he says, my father sometimes he reminded you of a sick animal, head down, head lowered. Just looking at you made you feel tired. He just made you feel so tired. And I want to shake him and I want to tell him, like, just fight, stand up and fight for what you believe in. But I don't. And yeah, when Apiwe spoke those lines, when I heard him say those lines for the first time, I just like wanted to cry, because for me they encapsulate the whole like question in the story, which is like, how much do the older generation's decisions
impact us,
and like how much of these decisions, how much agency do we actually have, you know? Yeah, it's really like, it's a complicated thing.
And I'm glad that at least in this space, in the creative space, you know, we have the artistic license to venture into each other's worlds a lot more than somebody would in, say, a traditional corporate space. And I think, excuse me, I think especially in a country like South Africa, where a lot of sensitivity is required, this kind of sort of crossing over and stepping into somebody else's shoes is so necessary. Because I think it's a great learning opportunity for us as people to really acknowledge real things that people are dealing with, you know, consequences of the past. And once we can learn from history, we can actually and learn from history and see how it truly affects the everyday person. We can sort of make a way forward. How do you feel about that? Is that sort of the messaging behind this? What was your intention there?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not like the kind of artist who is trying to like put an explicit like political message into my work. I think that my viewpoints around like, or my feelings around like capitalist ideologies and how like difficult this oppressive system is to navigate as a South African are pretty clear in the play. But I have this like piece of paper stuck above my writing desk, and I always look at this little quote by Emily Dickinson. She says, I actually have it like stuck right above my computer. She says, "I measure every grief I meet with narrow probing eyes. I wonder if it weighs like mine or has an easier size." I just love that idea of like, you know, kind of seeing people for who they are, and like trying to make that imaginative or that empathetic leap into someone else's experience. And that is like what art requires us to do, you know, whatever your medium is. It's like, as a writer or as a filmmaker, it requires you to make that leap of empathy beyond yourself. And same thing as a viewer, whether you're in the theater or you're watching a film, it requires you to make that leap and to see like what your connections are to the material, rather than focusing on like what divides us.
Another moment that stood out to me was when Silumku sat down in the field, supposedly to take a nap, and the floating radio comes and lands next to him. It was interesting how he was sort of listing all the different things he was listening to on the radio, all the different stories. And then at one point, he mentioned a murder, a story about a murder that he had heard. And then immediately started talking about the good music that they played. And I thought it was so funny and also a little bit sad, because we're so truly like desensitized in this country. I think as South Africans, we're a nation of PTSD riddled individuals. And we just don't realize it. And I think that theater, and particularly immersive theater in this case, can be a very therapeutic tool. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really genuinely believe in the power of art, but especially theater, to be a healing tool. Like, I have definitely had some of my most kind of core shifting internal moments happen inside a theater. And I think the same can be said for other people too. There's something that happens in that exchange between the actor and the audience, where like you make some kind of a connection, or you're seeing yourself reflected, or you're seeing your own story reflected. And there's something very crucial and very magical that can happen. But, as well as being a space for healing, I think it can be like a really important tool for asking difficult questions. Like we've seen with the US elections, the power of storytelling and the power of a good story to change people's minds. It's not through an argument that you change people's minds, it's through a story. But yeah, I mean, and also we've seen, like throughout the history of theatre in South Africa, we've seen the way that theatre has been used as a political tool to be able to tell stories, about oppression and about triumphing over oppression, and to be able to imagine future possibilities that don't already exist, but like at least in these playful spaces we can like simulate them, we can imagine them, and then one day hopefully they can be real.
Absolutely. I think now we're getting to the really exciting bit where we talk about otherworldly moments and out-of-body experiences and those kind of really sort of typical theatre process. But before I dive into a world that we should probably have a discussion that we should probably have offline. I want to, I think that it was so cleverly crafted the way Silumku's dancing scene depicted this out-of-body experience. It was kind of like, for those who are watching it through a VR headset, it kind of felt like you were watching somebody have an out-of-body experience while you were kind of having your own out-of-body experience. So tell me about this moment, and tell me how it came about. Was this a sort of a conscious decision that you made, and how does this moment differ from the actual play?
So in the play, Silumko comes to Joburg and he immediately starts a job on the same construction site that his father was killed on, because that's where he has like a foot in the door. His cousin gets him a job there. But his real passion is dancing, and he really, really wants to pursue that, but does not see how that is a possibility in his future. And it was interesting, like the parallels also with Apiwe. Like Apiwe has, all these different pressures in his life. I'm talking about Apiwe, the actor now. But he is this most unbelievable dancer. That is his background. Like, he's first trained in dancing. And so in the story, like, dancing symbolizes this ability to kind of transcend the like everyday pain and like just chokingness of being in the city or being in the world, and just like go to this other level of like freedom and beauty and joy. So we wanted to have that kind of a moment in the film, and I said to Apiwe, like, so we had this beautiful piece of music from they call themselves Dumama and Quechua, but Guguletu Duma is her name. She's currently based in Berlin, but she's a Eastern Cape. She's from the Eastern Cape. musician, and she had read the play, and she gave us this piece of music, which was just so beautiful and so right for the show and for the film. And I said to her, Piwe, do you want to choreograph something for this moment? And he was like, maybe, but maybe we should just see what happens on the day. And so when we filmed it, we were just like in this tiny room, and we just put the music on, and Piwe started to perform. And I'm pretty sure he was just improvising the whole thing, but it was like truly a transcendent experience. Like all of us in the room and Joanna, who was directing over Zoom, we were just like totally speechless, because yeah, it's just beautiful. And I was so afraid that feeling wasn't going to come across in the film, but I think it does. Yeah,
it absolutely does. And I'm sure for those who are coming from the theatre space, or even the film space, or any creative space, I think watching this talk, they'd want to get into the mechanics of how you actually went about translating this theatre piece to 360. So tell us a little bit about that, and what would your advice be for people who are wanting to venture into the space?
So there's a few different parts to that question. I guess it was a little bit unique the way that we made this 360 film, because of the kind of different elements that we used. So first of all, because we were in the middle of a pandemic, we couldn't just go outside and shoot with a 360 camera, which is what maybe we normally would have done. Second of all, yeah, so that was the first thing that made us decide, okay, we need to do this on green screen. And we need to either try and build the environment or see what we can do with the landscape that he's going to be in, because we just can't go and get the footage that we would want to go and get. So we knew that we were going to film him on green screen. We didn't have the setup to be able to do like a 360 green screen space. So we had to just like work with a 2D flat, like one wall green screen space. And so we had two cameras set up at the same time, filming Piwe on the green screen. So one was just like a regular, like a 2D camera. And the other was a depth kit, which I guess I'll talk about a little bit more. But depth kit is essentially, it's like a 2D camera, but it's photogrammetry. So it films the performer with depth. It gives them depth, which is a little bit of an ironic thing with 360, because there's no depth in 360. Like I'm sure many people watching this will know the difference between like 360, 3DOF and 6DOF, but
and true VR.
Yeah,
true.
Yeah, true VR. But yeah, so 3DOF is just like 3 dimensions of freedom, which is 360 video, where you are just like in one place and you can like look around and up and down like that. And then 6DOF, which is what the new project that Franz and I are working on now, which is a whole other thing, is 6 degrees of freedom, where you can actually move and you can interact and you can touch things. So that is kind of when depth kit is traditionally used in 6DOF, because you know there's depth, you can look around it. But what ended up happening was, like when you look at the film and you see Piwe's body has been filmed with the depth kit, there's this weird kind of ghostly effect that happens that you don't get when you just film an actor in 2D. So it was really interesting with the depth kit. And then we were saying, like, what are we going to do about not being able to shoot with 360? Like, we're in lockdown, we can't go out. And my partner Franz Knutzer is as you know, a video artist, and we were looking back at some of his previous work, and we realized that he had archival footage that he had shot in the Eastern Cape, of like in the middle of nowhere with the Nguni cows and with the aloes. And he also had 360 footage that he had shot in Joburg, like on the top of a super tall building in the middle of the CBD. And it was just like this most amazing revelation. Like he was like, oh, I just happen to have this footage that I haven't used before.
Just happen to have it on a hard
Just
drive
happen to have
somewhere.
this hard drive 360, amazing quality 360 footage. And so that's what we did. And so then we put the green screen onto that background, you know, with the depth kit, and we just experimented and built that world. And Francois was really instrumental in working to build that really rich, like 3-dimensional world, which we always wanted to be really like quite experimental, you know, rather than trying to immerse people in like a super realistic space. We were interested in seeing like what we could do with mixing things up and changing the environment around you and having aloes grow up out of the floor and the sky changing, and yeah.
And I really want to sort of demystify the process for people, because I think one looks at the technology used to create 360 and 6-star VR, and you think of the behind the scenes of sci-fi movies like The Mandalorian, and your mind races, but in actuality it's quite experimental. And if your budget is not that of The Mandalorian, then the teams can range from anything between 1 to 5 people.
Yeah.
And it's tiny, it's experimental, and I think we'll break this bit into 2 sections. So the first being, because theatre is such a highly collaborative process, what was it like transitioning into filming in 360, given that, you know, obviously we've just mentioned it's a very experimental process where it's tiny teams and you kind of wear many hats. So what was that transition like?
Yeah, I mean, we were definitely missing the feeling of collaboration that happens in a theatrical rehearsal process. But, you know, there's other things that are possible in this process that just aren't possible in that theatrical process. So there's pros and cons. But in our, like Francois and I, in our low def film factory work, we always work in a very collaborative way. And we've also always worked in a really DIY way, where we've had basically no budget or really little budget. And, you know, we just try and do it anyway. And I really think that that is possible with 360, you know, like a 360 camera, you know, the bottom of the range one is not expensive. And it's not a complicated thing to use either. It's just a little bit more challenging in terms of, like, if you're coming from a filmmaking background and you're used to thinking of the frame in a 2D way, you don't have really control, or you have to work harder to have control over where people's eyes are and drawing people's focus to certain things at certain times. But as a theatre maker, and as many theatre makers will know, with theatre you kind of relinquish that control anyway. Like, especially with immersive theatre, which is already like a big thing in South Africa, you kind of just have to like trust that the audience like needs to have their own agency, and you can't always control exactly what they're looking at and for how long. And especially with 360, with like 360 video, in a way, theatre's been doing that for a really long time. Like theatre in the round, you know, where the audience is surrounding the stage and looking in on the stage, and the subject is in the middle. It's just actually 360 video flipped, inverted. So it's not like a hugely new concept for theatre makers, actually. Like, I think it's less of an imaginative leap or a technical leap than it is if you're coming from a filmmaking background. But there definitely were challenges to making this film during the pandemic. Like, for example, Apiwe could only really come and shoot with us once, and Joanna had to direct the performance over Zoom, which was just like, you know, really difficult. And then doing the subtitles, there is actually a funny story attached to that, Kirstin. Because obviously, like, we decided to translate the whole thing into Xhosa for the play, for the film. And we were debating whether or not we were going to, do the whole play in Xhosa or not. But so Apiwe translated the whole script into Xhosa, but he left our studio without leaving behind what he had written down, the translations that he had written down. And so when we got into the edit, I was like, okay, I know what the lines are, but I'm not always 100% sure if Apiwe was saying them exactly as translated. And so I needed to phone him over WhatsApp, and he was in like a really poor signal area. And eventually how we did the subtitles for this film was me sending a WhatsApp voice note where I was holding my phone up to the screen and having him say his line in Xhosa, and then he would listen to it where he was sitting like in a crowded cafe or something where you could get Wi-Fi, and then he would reply back, okay, Ames, what I'm saying is this and this and this. So it took us literally hours to do the subtitles. Can you imagine doing them that way over WhatsApp voice note? But all of these things are part of this like messy, totally, someone comments high-low tech, like this messy process of like working with fairly complicated technology, but also in this super low def way,
I think that this pandemic has just showed us that if there's a will, there's a way. It doesn't matter what challenges are thrown at us, we'll absolutely get through it.
But Kirstin, just to say like about your comment about demystifying these technologies, I think Electric South is like really doing a lot to open up the 360 space, especially on this continent. And for me, like, it's up until now we've kind of seen like VR, people making VR, using it as an opportunity to show off the tech and like how well they know the tech and what they can do with tech and big budgets. But it needs to actually be the other way around. It needs to be that the storytelling comes first, and that's what we have on this continent. Is we have amazing stories and we have incredible storytellers, and it's now like our opportunity to move into that space with that approach in mind, which is that the story needs to come first. It first needs to be artistically compelling, and then the understanding of the tech can come afterwards. But for me, it can't really be the other way around. It's not interesting.
Absolutely. And I think aside from just the interesting stories, I think that by doing it at a sort of grassroots level, we start to build audiences organically. And I think that I was watching one of the first talks of the festival where Tegan Bristow of the Fakugezi Festival mentioned how this year has resulted in them going online, obviously. And with that being said, they were able to reach audiences which they haven't been able to reach in the past. And I'm sure the same can be said for the National Arts Festival that took place in June of this year. And I think that theatre is, even though we have an oral tradition of storytelling on the continent, I think that theatre is still quite niche. And I think even though it's embedded into our culture, I think that the individuals in the space have sort of been operating sort of as a need to adapt to COVID, as if it were just a small moment in time. But in terms of building an audience and creating new skills and providing jobs, I think it could be pivoting online seems to have been the best thing for us this year. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in our work as the Low Def Film Factory, we have seen this year how many artists who have previously been so intimidated by the idea of taking their live practice online are just needing to embrace it. But at the same time, I think it's important to have the conversation about being still looking critically at these technologies. You know, they are becoming much more accessible, and I think, like with Facebook's drive to turn the whole world immersive in the next however many years, they're just going to keep on becoming more and more and more accessible. And I mean, yes, you can watch like 360 with Google Cardboard, and it's becoming way more accessible, but we still need to have that conversation about, you know, it's the question is always around, like, it's not around what the technology can do necessarily, but it's about who uses the technology and what you use the technology for. Like, is it being used to advance, you know, important political conversations? Is it being used to ask difficult questions? Is it being used to open up spaces for dialogue, for inclusivity? Is it being used to like tell really diverse stories and also show those stories in a variety of spaces? I think these are questions that we're all grappling with, and especially now that we're working with six staff, like we are making a, you know, a six staff VR experience. The barriers to entry for artists are much, much higher than with 360 because the tech is complicated, you know, like learning to code on Unity, that is not something every artist is going to be able to do. I certainly am not. But I think the feeling around, as you say, like not just considering this to be one moment where we have to just for the moment, like, oh shit, we have to all put our work online and then hopefully we can just go back to the way we were doing things. Like, that's not really the case. But having said that, I do, you know, I'm not just like this tech utopianist who believes that digital work is the solution to everything. There's still like something so magical about live theater that I'm not ready to give up just yet.
To forego. Yeah. I think the key thing we need to just sort of practice is cautious optimism. I think that, as you mentioned, there's quite a shift and quite a movement in especially the immersive space, XR, at the moment. I think that COVID was sort of just like the driving force to sort of push everything or accelerate everything at a pace that nobody would have predicted. But I absolutely love what you're what it seems that you're advocating for is that it should be sort of a blend between the old and the new, a blend between, you know, traditional theatre and a blend between sort of pivoting to this new way of doing things. I like the thought of still being able to do what you know your heart is set on, but then also reaching audiences. Do you think that this is something that you'll sort of replicate again? Do you see yourself taking other pieces of works that you create for a theatre audience and turning it into an immersive 360 piece or six staff piece? Is this something that we'll be seeing you doing in the near future?
Yeah, I think I'm really excited about the medium now. And I was kind of thinking about when I started to really see this space as an interesting possibility, and it reminded me of how last year I was in New York and I was trying to make a little bit of extra money, and I signed up to a trial, sort of like a clinical trial, but it was a VR trial that Columbia University was running. So no danger to my health, like taking any weird pills or anything. I just had to go for a couple of days and do some VR experiences. And they were running studies on the power of VR to stimulate like racial empathy. So they put you into the like body and the hands of someone who was like a different race and a different age and a different background from you, and they had you move through these experiences, and they kind of were like, you know, gathering data on the power of VR as like an empathy machine. You know, you've heard that term before, people call VR an empathy machine. But it started to really to get me thinking about this medium and like the power of this medium for like, you know, stimulating empathy in a way that it just isn't the same as when you have that distance on the screen, on a 2D screen. And I think, you know, like South African theatre makers have a really, really distinctive style. And I think it would be a great shame in adapting to these new technologies and these new mediums to lose that distinctiveness that makes our theatre so unique and so powerful. And so I'm hoping that this shift, and I do think that this shift is going to be something positive rather than us just moving towards like trying to emulate Hollywood type, like super slick, you know, VR experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, just with what you mentioned just now about South Africa having a very distinct style, another space where they have a very distinct style of theatre is in London, particularly the Royal Shakespeare Academy, and the Royal Shakespeare Company, and what they're doing is sort of really exciting me. We've seen with The Tempest how they collaborated with Intel and Andy Serkis's The Imaginarium. And we also see smaller companies pop up, like Darkfield that created Seance, and ... that created Somni, and Jeff Wayne's The War of the Worlds. It seems to really be a trend that's picking up in London. They're sort of spearheading this immersive theatre space. And I think that, you know, there's absolutely no reason that we can't find our own style and sort of bring those practices to Africa. I think that, in fact, one would argue that because we have an oral tradition of storytelling, that we would be able to do so quite easily. What do you think the future of immersive theatre looks like on the continent?
Yeah, I think a lot, you know, the National Theatre, for example, has been doing really great work for a couple of years around making theatre more accessible by bringing it into cinemas across the world. And it's definitely really interesting to see what kind of shifts are happening within like the VR space. But I think for me, a lot of the productions that you're talking about, their budgets are huge, like really, really, really big, The Tempest and War of the Worlds. But I agree with you. I think there's some kind of middle ground which can happen for South African theatre, which in my eyes has been needing a shift for some time. Not saying a shift away from live performance, but just a shift into the current moment and like thinking more about accessibility. And 360 is a great way to do that, because you can just pop a 360 camera into the middle of a theatrical experience and the audience can just like be there. You don't need to have like a really complicated setup to be able to do that.
Absolutely. So it looks like we've still got a bit of time, and I see that we've got a few questions here already. So I think let's dive into that. So Jenna Gardini says that I really love the idea that digital theatre can make the theatre more accessible for larger audiences. We do too. Were viewers able to watch the play on devices like their cell phones? And did you get any feedback on what the experience of watching the play was like on the different devices?
Yeah. It's quite an interesting thing, Jenna. Hi, Jenna. Because I was thinking about, you know, that feeling of when you're at the National Arts Festival and you get your little review that comes out in the newspaper, or you can just feel what is happening between you and an audience member if you're on stage or if you're backstage. You get that kind of real-time feedback of how people are experiencing the work. But it's so different showing it on digital platforms, because you need to like rely on critical feedback, or people to, like, artist friends to send you messages being like, I liked your work or whatever. But and Kirstin and I were talking about, I mean, Tara and I from Electric South were talking about this beforehand, about problems of people watching stuff on their phones versus watching it on their laptop screens, because your phone is such a tiny screen, and it does make me a little bit sad to think about people watching the work on such a tiny screen and scrolling around and like looking around on this tiny screen. I'm not sure that it's exactly the full and rich experience that I would hope. Obviously, watching it on a headset is the ideal, but that's not really realistic for most people. But I've had good feedback from a couple of people who have watched it on laptops, who said that they, with headphones especially, because it's quite a sonic experience as well, who said that they really enjoyed the experience of being able to click around. It's still very new for a lot of people to be able to look up and down and around.
And I think, you know, we kind of, the questions that I posed to you and the answers that you gave were sort of, we were thinking in sort of best case scenario, but I think another reality that we have to face here in Africa is accessibility to the hardware. Not everybody has a few thousands of rands lying around to purchase headsets, and not everybody has access to the technology. So that's something that we have to consider as well. What do you? Is it sort of like a massive compromise for you as a creator to sort of knowing that audiences may be seeing, larger audiences may be seeing the works, but they're not seeing it the way you intend for them to see it, which is through an actual headset? Is that a sort of a big compromise for you? Or do you feel like it's fine at this moment because we're just beginning?
I think for me, it's less of a problem because I am not as interested in the idea of, like, presence is this big buzz term with VR and 360, like presence. You have to get people to feel so immersed in the work that they completely forget that they have bodies and forget that they have hands, and like just like escape to this total other world. It's like this utopian thing, which is cool, and there's definitely a place for it. Like, I'm not, you know, against people who make that kind of work, but for me, I'm less trying to make work that makes people forget that they're in the world, and more tries to bring them actually closer to the world through a digital experience. So like actually gets people to like ask questions and always bring it back to like real world questions, real world relationships, real world politics. So the presence and the immersion question for me is less important than like what is the story doing, because for me, like a powerful story in this world where you can look around is not that's the thing, you know, that's the thing that's like grabbing people and keeping them staying in that experience. And that's the thing that's, whether it's in theater or whether it's in literature or in VR, that's the thing that is getting people to either make that imaginative leap to say, okay, I believe this, or I don't.
So content is king, essentially.
Content is king. Yeah.
Okay. And we seem to have a Facebook question here as well. How would you distribute theatrical VR experiences in the future, with particular focus on the continent?
Geez, that is a question more for Electric South than for me as an artist. Distribution is not really my field of expertise, but I will say that Electric South is doing the Lord's work in terms of distribution of African content.
Where would you want this to be seen?
To be honest, I would want this to be seen in like more and more places across South Africa. Like, I'm less interested in it touring to film festivals in Europe or VR festivals in Europe than I am in really trying to think about how to create spaces where this work can be consumed, where it's more accessible. Like, I would love for independent or even, you know, government art spaces in this country to start thinking a little bit more about how to show this kind of content, and to make it more accessible. Like, I'm talking libraries, I'm talking galleries, like museums. I don't think we are quite there yet, but I'm hoping that we'll get there. I mean, for example, with this question about distributing VR experiences, the experience that we're working on now, Francois and I, which is a 6DOF experience. I mean, it's made for the Oculus Quest, it's expensive. It's not something that, you know, just everyone has. And the only reason that we have it is because of Francois taking part in Electric South's lab. But it's very difficult for institutions in South Africa to show their work on a Quest because it's just like an expensive piece of equipment to get. So what ends up happening with a lot of great work from this continent is it gets just immediately, it just gets shown in like European festivals or like festivals in the US, because everyone's already on the Quest, everyone's showing work on the Quest. So yeah, we have to like think more about these questions of how do we make this work more accessible, and this festival is a perfect example of it.
And I think this year particularly, internally, there was a big discussion around how do we get government to sort of get more involved? Because I think the key thing that's lacking on the continent is not obviously the talent or the lack of stories, it's the lack of infrastructure. But I can say with great certainty that we will see more government involvement in these types of projects. I think that government has seen the value in us pivoting to the moment. And I think that festivals, both locally and internationally, have their eyes on what we're creating. They're hungry for our stories. So I think that we'll see distribution in multiple areas. We'll see it in sort of traditional film festival spaces. We'll see it in galleries. South Africa has its own virtual reality gallery called Tomorrow Gallery. And they're doing some incredible things. They're based in Joburg. I think we'll see a lot more of that popping up. And just before the lockdown, Electric South we were going into communities, and we were taking our headsets with us, and we were exposing young people to this technology. So I think that at the moment, the question we may not be able to answer the question very sort of vividly, but there are many things at play, and it will eventually, once the infrastructure starts growing, things will be a lot more clearer. But just for now, if you are trying to get into this and you are thinking about distribution, I think that you can think along the lines of traditional film distribution, and then possibly once it's safe to do so, you could. You kind of have the power to exhibit your own work. So you don't have to go to a big Ster-Kinekor or New Metro. You can host an event and have people come in and engage with your work and have one-on-one discussions with you. It flips the narrative in terms of what a premiere looks like. So I would, from my perspective, I would just encourage people who are thinking about this to expand their mind in terms of what's possible, because absolutely anything is possible. You have online and you have in person, and you can blend the two, or you can isolate it. There's a plethora of opportunities available to you, which you could use.
And I
up
mean,
to you to,
if you have a 360 camera, or if you can get access to a cheap 360 camera and just start experimenting with it. Like, I remember in the early days of Francois making 360 work for the first time in Makanda, like setting up the 360 camera and having to like run out of the way because, you know, it shoots all around, and ducking behind trees, but just like experimenting with that. And then also with the software, like just getting yourself familiar with like how to edit 360 video, you know, and build your practice around that.
And getting out of your comfort zone and venturing into the tech world and connecting with people that are doing the tech side of things. The immersive community is very small in Africa, but everyone is connected. And you pose a question to the community, and I promise you it's answered within the minute. The We Are VR Josie group chat or website, or wherever they're based on a number of platforms, but in that community, you ask a question and it's answered almost immediately. So I think it's just venturing out of your comfort zone and meeting the correct people if you're wanting to venture into this space. And then I see, Amy, there's another question. Yesterday's panel discussed the idea of equity in the immersive space. Do you find that there are any limitations or issues of equality in this new field you find yourself in, especially as a woman?
I think VR is still quite a like white bro space. Because I think what happened was a lot of the community migrated over from the gaming community, which is like predominantly white males. And so I think that is kind of the reason for why the VR community is like still very white dude dominated. And definitely from an investment perspective, I think that's still the case. But on a personal level, you know, because I've been working kind of outside of institutional spaces, like I've been working pretty much in my own little network of collaborators that I trust. I can't say that I've really experienced it too much, but I think the field in general, there is still a major problem with it being really white bro-ish and just white people-ish, I think. But definitely organizations like Electric South are doing the most to try to shift that dynamic in terms of like the people that they work with, and also in terms of the kind of work that they support and show on the festival. So hopefully it's changing.
And I think that because the space is so new and so unsaturated, both in South Africa, Africa, and globally, storytelling, immersive storytelling is still in its infancy. We have communities internationally like France and Germany and the USA and the UK where they have access to funding. But despite that, the community is still tiny, and it's the perfect opportunity for people with stories to tell to get involved. I think if you have a good story, regardless of who you are, what gender, what race, it's absolutely irrelevant at this point, because it's a community of open-minded individuals who are so willing to take on a good story. I think that this is the one space, because it's so unsaturated, it's the one space where you shouldn't be afraid. You should leave all your limiting beliefs at the door and just go straight ahead and do what it is that you want to do within the space. I think that now there's never been a better opportunity than now, if this is something that interests you.
Yeah, and I think that like we are at a crossroads with this like technology, particularly in South Africa, where, you know, like in Silicon Valley, all of these like Google and Apple and whatever are kind of fighting for like domination over the immersive space. Like everyone is trying to see how much of that space they can essentially colonize. And, you know, like Facebook launched Facebook Spaces in 2016 when they started to like introduce users to the idea of this immersive space, or like immersivity. And recently you will have seen people like using their avatars and whatever. But I think it's like only a matter of time before, you know, like this immersive digital ecosystem is like really just with us. So I feel like we are at some kind of a crossroads now with thinking about how we are going to adopt these technologies in a careful and responsible way. And that's really like where we're at now as artists, as filmmakers, and as people in this industry.
Absolutely. I'm going to see if we have any other questions. No, I think we've answered everybody's burning questions. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with before we say our goodbyes? Is there anything about the film, anything about this experience, anything about this entire sort of festival process that you just want to share, any sort of last thoughts on?
Yeah, I think, you know, in the last couple of months, I've been working with a lot of artists who are at such a point where they're challenged in their practice, especially artists who just want to be on stage, or just want to be dancing, just want to be performing, or just want to be making out in the world, making work in the way that they used to before. And, you know, I'm hoping that we're not going to be in this kind of situation that we're in forever, but I do feel like while we're in it, we need to try to like use it as an opportunity to grow ourselves as artists and to see like what is possible for us in mediums that we never thought that we would be able to work in. And it's definitely something that's happened for me this year, like teaching myself quite a few different things, and like just like looking on the internet and being like Googling like how do I use whatever, you know. And this is something that anyone can do. Like I'm really not a particularly technically proficient person, and I've never considered myself such, but I consider myself an artist. And when I was listening to the Atomu panel with Sharifa and Yatunde the other day, who have the beautiful work Atomu on this festival, Sharifa was talking about the responsibility of artists to bring your stories into your time. She was speaking particularly about like bringing traditional Kenyan stories into the current moment, but I think the thing applies of like, we need to find ways to tell stories, and we need to find ways to engage audiences. It's crucial. It's actually a matter of life and death. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that artists who are listening to this, or will take this as like a call to action.
Absolutely. And I think also just in terms of once your work has been created, there are people in the space that are keen to see what you're doing. So get in contact with your Electric Souths, get in contact with, find out who your local VR producers are. Find out who is sort of creating works in the space, because 9 times out of 10, that person will know someone who knows someone who might just be able to help you with whatever it is that you need. The community, like I said, is really, really small, and there shouldn't be anything stopping you from starting. Now is the time. There's never been a better time for storytelling or stories coming from the African continent. There's never been a better time for immersive storytelling. And I think that African females in particular, have a very distinct voice, and just people are hungry to hear what you have to say. So don't for 1 minute look at the technology and think that's not possible. Absolutely anything is possible in this space. So just ask the right questions and connect with the communities. You'll find that things are a lot more straightforward than they would. Well, they appear straightforward, but you'd find that things are the barriers to entry are a lot more straightforward than what they appear. It's just new at the moment, so people don't really know much about it. But it's a good space to be in.
Yeah. Hopeful space.
Yeah, absolutely. So Amy, I want to say thank you very much to you. Thank you for sharing your work with us, and thank you for this discussion. I hope that everybody watching has found it useful. And if you haven't seen it already, Another Kind of Dying is showing today and tomorrow. The festival is completely free, and you do not need a headset to view the works. How cool is that? Yeah, this is the last panel for the festival, girl. We've made it.
We made
it. Happy birthday once again to Ingrid, and thank you to the team, and thank you to our sponsors. And we look forward to seeing you next year.
Thank you so much, Kirstin. Thanks, everyone.